The dust kicked up beneath Penelope Lancaster's worn boots as she stepped onto the weathered boardwalk of Carlin, Nevada, her entire life reduced to a single carpet bag and the $20 sewn into the hem of her dress. It was July 1876, and the summer heat shimmered off the dirt street like water, making the small frontier town waver in her vision as she approached the general store with a list of essentials she desperately needed. Her father had died 3 months ago from consumption, leaving her orphaned at 21 with nothing but debts and a reputation tarnished by his drinking and gambling. She had traveled from Virginia City with the last of her money, hoping to start fresh where nobody knew her name or her father's shame. The general store stood at the corner of the main street, a sturdy wooden building with a faded sign that read Miller's General Goods in peeling paint. Penelope pushed open the door and a small bell chimed above her head. The interior was dim and cool compared to the blazing heat outside, filled with the scent of tobacco, leather, and coffee beans. Rows of shelves held everything from canned goods to bolts of fabric, and behind the counter stood a thin man with graying hair and suspicious eyes that tracked her every movement. "Good afternoon," Penelope said, trying to keep her voice steady and confident despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. "I need to purchase some supplies." The storekeeper, presumably Mr. Miller, looked her up and down with barely concealed contempt. His gaze lingered on her faded dress and the way her boots were scuffed and worn at the heels. "Cash only," he said curtly. "No credit." "I have cash," Penelope replied, pulling a small purse from her bag. She had been careful with her money, knowing it had to last until she could find work. "I need flour, coffee, beans, some salt pork if you have it, and fabric for a new dress." Miller's thin lips pressed into a hard line. "Store's about to close." Penelope glanced at the window where sunlight still blazed through the glass. It could not have been later than 4 in the afternoon. "The sign on your door says you're open until 6. I decide when I close," Miller said, his voice flat and unfriendly. "And I'm telling you we're closed." Heat that had nothing to do with the Nevada summer flushed through Penelope's cheeks. "Sir, I only need a few things. I can pay. I will be quick about it. I said we're closed." Miller crossed his arms over his narrow chest. "And even if we weren't, I don't do business with certain types." The words hit Penelope like a physical blow. "Certain types? What do you mean by that?" "I heard about you when you came into town yesterday," Miller said, his tone growing more hostile. "Heard your father was a drunk and a cheat. Heard he owed money all over Virginia City before he died. I don't need that kind of trouble in my store." Penelope's hands trembled as she gripped her purse tighter. Shame and anger warred within her chest, making it hard to breathe. "My father's debts have nothing to do with me. I am trying to make an honest living. Not in my store, you aren't." Miller turned his back on her, making a show of organizing items on the shelf behind the counter. "Get out. I won't tell you again." The humiliation burned through Penelope's entire body. She had known people might judge her for her father's actions, but she had not expected such blatant cruelty. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give this horrible man the satisfaction of seeing her cry. The bell above the door chimed again and heavy footsteps entered the store. Penelope did not turn around, too focused on maintaining her composure as she prepared to leave. She could feel a presence behind her, large and imposing, and then a deep voice rumbled through the space like distant thunder. "Afternoon, Miller. Need some tobacco and coffee." The storekeeper's entire demeanor changed in an instant. His hostile expression melted into something resembling nervousness and he turned around quickly. "Mr. Wade, of course, right away." Penelope finally glanced over her shoulder and felt her breath catch. The man who had entered stood well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that seemed to fill the doorway he had just passed through. His arms were thick with muscle, visible beneath the rolled-up sleeves of his worn flannel shirt. Dark hair fell past his shoulders, tied back loosely with a leather cord, and a full beard covered the lower half of his tanned face. His eyes were a striking green, sharp and observant as they took in the scene before him. He looked like he had stepped down from the mountains themselves, wild and powerful and utterly unlike anyone Penelope had ever encountered. "Who's this?" the mountain man asked, his gaze settling on Penelope with an intensity that made her heart skip. "Nobody," Miller said quickly. "Just someone leaving." The green eyes narrowed slightly, and the mountain man looked from Miller to Penelope and back again. "Doesn't look like she's done with her business." "She doesn't have any business here," Miller said, some of his earlier hostility creeping back into his voice, though it was notably more restrained than when he had addressed Penelope alone. "I reserve the right to refuse service to anyone." "That so?" The mountain man moved further into the store, and Penelope noticed the way Miller actually took a step back. And why would you refuse service to a lady who's clearly got money to spend? Miller's jaw worked as if he were chewing on his words before spitting them out. That's my affair, Wade, not yours. Fletcher, the mountain man said, and it took Penelope a moment to realize he was introducing himself to her, not addressing the storekeeper. Fletcher Wade. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of courtesy that seemed almost out of place given his rough appearance. Penelope Lancaster, she replied softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Fletcher turned his full attention back to Miller, and the temperature in the store seemed to drop despite the summer heat. Now, Mr. Miller, I'm going to ask you one more time. Why are you refusing to serve Miss Lancaster? Her father was a drunk and a gambler, Miller said, lifting his chin defiantly despite the tremor in his voice. I don't want that element in my store. Her father, Fletcher repeated slowly, as if tasting the words and finding them distasteful. Not her, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. The silence that followed was so complete that Penelope could hear the ticking of a clock somewhere in the store. Fletcher took another step forward, and now he was standing right at the counter. His presence seemed to swallow all the available space, making Miller look smaller and more pathetic by comparison. That's about the stupidest thing I've ever heard, Fletcher said, his voice quiet but carrying an edge that made Penelope's skin prickle. And I've heard some pretty stupid things in my time. You're telling me you're going to judge this lady based on her father's mistakes? It's my store, Miller said, but his voice had lost its conviction. It's the only store in 50 miles, Fletcher countered, which makes it a necessity for folks trying to survive out here. Now, I've been coming to this store for near on 5 years, and I spend good money here, probably more than most folks in this town, so I figure my opinion ought to count for something. Miller swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thin throat. Mr. Wade, I appreciate your business, but nothing. Fletcher leaned forward slightly, his hands flat on the counter. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to apologize to Miss Lancaster right now for your rudeness and your unfair treatment. Then you're going to sell her whatever she needs at fair prices. And if I ever hear of you treating her poorly again, I'll take my business elsewhere. And I'll make sure everyone else in this territory knows why. Penelope's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Nobody had ever stood up for her like this, especially not a stranger. She wanted to speak, to tell Fletcher that it was all right, that she would find another way. But the words stuck in her throat. Miller's face had gone pale, then flushed red with anger and embarrassment. His eyes darted between Fletcher and Penelope, clearly trying to calculate which option would cost him more. The calculation did not take long. I apologize, Miss Lancaster, Miller said through gritted teeth. I was hasty in my judgment. Look at her when you say it, Fletcher commanded. And say it like you mean it. Miller's jaw clenched so hard Penelope could see the muscles jumping beneath his skin. He turned to face her fully, and though his eyes were still cold, his voice was marginally more sincere. I apologize for my rudeness. Miss Lancaster, it was wrong of me to judge you based on your father's actions. Please accept my apology. Penelope nodded slowly, not trusting her voice. The apology might have been forced, but it was more than she had expected to receive. Now sell the lady her supplies, Fletcher said, straightening up but not moving away from the counter. I'll wait. The next several minutes passed in awkward silence as Miller gathered the items on Penelope's list. He weighed out the flour and beans, wrapped the salt pork in brown paper, and even showed her several bolts of fabric without complaint. Through it all, Fletcher stood nearby, his arms crossed over his broad chest, watching every transaction like a guardian angel carved from mountain stone. When everything was tallied and Penelope paid her money, she gathered her purchases with shaking hands. The weight of what had just happened was beginning to settle on her shoulders, along with a profound gratitude toward the stranger who had intervened on her behalf. Thank you, she said to Miller. Though the words felt hollow, Miller grunted in response, already turning away to tend to Fletcher's order. Penelope headed toward the door, juggling her packages awkwardly. Before she could reach it, Fletcher was there, holding it open for her. The bell chimed as they stepped out into the blazing afternoon sun together. Thank you, Penelope said again, this time with genuine feeling flooding her voice. You did not have to do that. Yes, I did, Fletcher replied simply. A man like that shouldn't be allowed to treat people poorly, just because he's got something they need. He looked down at her packages. Where are you staying? The boarding house at the end of the street, Penelope said. Mrs. Cooper's place. I know it. Let me help you carry those. You have your own purchases to make, Penelope protested weakly. Miller can wait. Won't kill him to stew a bit longer. Fletcher took the heavier packages from her arms before she could object further. Come on, that sun's only getting hotter. They walked side by side down the dusty street, and Penelope was acutely aware of the curious stares they attracted. Fletcher Wade was clearly well known in Carlin, and here he was walking with the newcomer that the gossips had already decided was trouble. She could practically hear tongues wagging behind windows and doorways. "I am sorry if this causes problems for you," Penelope said softly. Fletcher glanced down at her, one eyebrow raised. "What kind of problems? People seeing you help me. After what Mr. Miller said about my father." "I don't give a damn what people say," Fletcher said bluntly, "never have. And anyone who would judge you for your father's mistakes isn't worth worrying about." They reached the boarding house, a two-story building with a wide porch and flower boxes in the windows. It was one of the nicer structures in town, painted white with green trim. Mrs. Cooper was particular about her establishment, which was why Penelope had been worried about securing a room. But the older woman had been kind, asking only for a week's rent in advance and no questions about her past. Fletcher carried the packages up onto the porch and set them down carefully near the door. When he straightened, he seemed even taller, and Penelope had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Thank you again, Mr. Wade," she said, meaning every word. "I do not know how to repay your kindness." "Don't need repayment," Fletcher said. "Just doing what's right." He hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his next words carefully. "If you need anything else, or if anyone gives you trouble, you can find me at the livery most days. I bring pelts and meat down from the mountains to trade." "You live in the mountains?" Penelope asked, curious despite herself. "Got a cabin about 15 miles north. Come into town every couple of weeks for supplies and to conduct business." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, barely visible beneath his beard. "Town life isn't for me, but the mountains can get lonely sometimes." Penelope felt a strange flutter in her chest at those words. There was something in his eyes, a loneliness that matched her own, that made her want to know more about this mysterious mountain man who had appeared like a hero from one of the dime novels she used to read. "Thank you for making town life a little more bearable for me today," she said with a small smile of her own. Fletcher touched his hat brim again in that same courteous gesture. "Welcome to Carlin, Miss Lancaster. Hope it treats you better from here on out." He turned and walked back down the street toward Miller's store, his long strides eating up the distance. Penelope watched him go, her heart still racing from the encounter. She had come to Carlin expecting nothing but hardship and judgment, and instead she had found an unexpected defender. Mrs. Cooper opened the door behind her, making Penelope jump. "I saw that," the older woman said, her eyes twinkling with interest. "Fletcher Wade himself carrying your packages. Now that's something worth noting." "He was just being kind," Penelope said, feeling her cheeks heat. "Fletcher Wade is many things. But he's not just anything," Mrs. Cooper said with a knowing smile. "That man keeps to himself mostly, doesn't bother with town affairs. For him to step in like that, well, you must have made an impression." Penelope gathered her packages and followed Mrs. Cooper inside, her mind whirling with thoughts of green eyes and strong hands and a deep voice that had commanded respect without raising its volume. She told herself not to read too much into it, that Fletcher had simply been a good man doing the right thing. But as she unpacked her supplies in her small room, she could not stop thinking about him. Over the next week, Penelope focused on settling into her new life in Carlin. She found work helping Mrs. Cooper with the boarding house, cleaning rooms, and preparing meals for the handful of permanent residents and occasional travelers who stopped for the night. The work was hard but honest, and Mrs. Cooper was fair with both wages and expectations. Penelope had a roof over her head, food in her stomach, and slowly building savings. But the incident at Miller's store had spread through the town like wildfire, and opinions were divided. Some people, like Mrs. Cooper and the blacksmith's wife, treated Penelope with kindness and respect. Others, following Miller's lead, kept their distance or whispered behind their hands when she passed. Penelope tried not to let it bother her, but some nights she lay in her narrow bed feeling the weight of loneliness pressing down on her chest. She saw Fletcher twice more during those first weeks. The first time was from a distance, as he loaded supplies onto a large draft horse outside the livery. Even from across the street she could see the easy strength in his movements, the way he lifted heavy sacks like they weighed nothing. He noticed her watching and raised a hand in greeting, and she waved back, grateful for the acknowledgement. The second time was more direct. She was hanging laundry in the yard behind the boarding house when she heard his voice from the other side of the fence. "Miss Lancaster, got a moment?" Penelope nearly dropped the shirt she was pinning to the line. She smoothed her apron and walked to the fence, where Fletcher stood with his hat in his hands. Up close in the bright morning light, she could see details she had missed before. The small scar above his left eyebrow, the way his green eyes had flecks of gold in them, the weathered tan of someone who spent most of his life outdoors. "Mr. Wade," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "What can I do for you?" "Wanted to check in," he said, his gaze direct and earnest. "Make sure Miller hasn't given you any more trouble." "No trouble," Penelope assured him. "I have not been back to his store, actually. Mrs. Cooper has been handling the shopping for the boarding house, and she shares supplies with me." Fletcher nodded slowly. "Good, that's good." He seemed to hesitate, then continued. "Also wanted to make sure you're settling in all right. Town can be hard on newcomers." "It has been challenging," Penelope admitted. "But Mrs. Cooper has been wonderful, and I have work, which is more than I had when I arrived. I am grateful." "You shouldn't have to be grateful for basic decency," Fletcher said with a slight frown. "But I'm glad you found a good situation." They stood in silence for a moment, and Penelope found herself not wanting him to leave. There was something calming about his presence, despite his intimidating size. Or perhaps because of it, she felt safe near him, protected in a way she had not felt in years. "The mountains must be beautiful this time of year," she said, grasping for something to continue the conversation. Fletcher's expression softened, and genuine warmth entered his eyes. "They are. Wildflowers everywhere right now. Streams running cold and clear from the snowmelt. Air so clean it almost hurts to breathe it." He paused, then added almost shyly, "I could show you sometime if you'd like, if you're not afraid of riding out a ways." Penelope's heart leaped at the invitation. "I would like that very much, though I should warn you, I am not an experienced rider." "I've got a gentle mare that would suit you just fine," Fletcher said, and now he was definitely smiling beneath his beard. "How about next Sunday? I could come by around 9 in the morning if Mrs. Cooper can spare you for a day." "Sunday is my half day," Penelope said, her own smile growing. "I would be delighted to see the mountains." They made their arrangements, and then Fletcher put his hat back on and took his leave. Penelope returned to her laundry with a lightness in her step that had been absent for months. She had a friend in Carlin, or at least the beginning of one, and if her heart beat a little faster at the thought of spending a whole day with Fletcher Wade, well, that was her own private business. Sunday dawned clear and hot, typical for Nevada in late July. Penelope woke early and took extra care with her appearance, braiding her honey-colored hair into a single plait down her back and wearing her most practical dress, a faded blue cotton that had seen better days but was still respectable. She packed a small basket with food from Mrs. Cooper's kitchen, a contribution to the outing, and waited on the front porch with barely contained excitement. Fletcher arrived precisely at 9, leading 2 horses. One was his large draft horse, a massive bay gelding with kind eyes. The other was a smaller chestnut mare with a white blaze down her face. Fletcher himself looked much the same as always, though Penelope noticed his hair was freshly washed and his beard neatly trimmed. "Miss Lancaster," he said, dismounting with fluid grace despite his size. "Are you ready for an adventure?" "As ready as I will ever be," Penelope replied, eyeing the mare with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Fletcher helped her mount, his hands strong and steady as he guided her foot into the stirrup and lifted her easily into the saddle. The casual display of strength made Penelope's breath catch, and she had to remind herself to focus on sitting properly. "Her name is Daisy," Fletcher said, adjusting Penelope's stirrups to the right length. "She's patient and sure-footed. Just give her a gentle nudge with your heels to get her moving and pull back on the reins when you want to stop. She'll mostly follow my horse anyway." They set out north from Carlin, leaving the dusty streets behind and heading into the open country. The terrain was harsh and beautiful, sagebrush and scrub dotting the arid landscape. But as they rode, climbing gradually higher, the scenery began to change. Trees appeared, first scattered pines and then denser stands of aspen and fir. The air grew cooler and carried the scent of pine and wildflowers. Fletcher had been right about Daisy. The mare followed his gelding placidly, requiring little guidance from Penelope. This freed her to look around and enjoy the journey, and to watch Fletcher, who sat his horse like he had been born in the saddle, relaxed and confident. "How long have you lived in the mountains?" Penelope asked as they followed a narrow trail through the trees. "About 7 years," Fletcher replied. "Came out here after the war, needed space and quiet after all that noise and death." "You fought in the war?" Penelope knew better than to ask which side. The war had ended 11 years ago, but the wounds were still fresh for many. "I did. 4 years of it." Fletcher's voice was distant, and Penelope could see tension in his shoulders. "Lost a lot of good men. Lost parts of myself too. When it was over, I couldn't go back to civilization. Felt too loud, too crowded. The mountains offered peace." "I am sorry," Penelope said softly. "War is terrible, it is." Fletcher glanced back at her and his expression cleared somewhat. "But that's old history. Tell me about you. What brought you to Nevada?" Penelope had known this question would come eventually, but she still hesitated before answering. My father died. He left debts and a bad reputation, as you heard Mr. Miller mention. I thought starting fresh somewhere new would be easier than staying where everyone knew me as the drunk's daughter. Is it easier? Fletcher asked. Sometimes, Penelope admitted. Other times I wonder if I made a mistake. But I am trying to build something better for myself. I want to be known for who I am, not who my father was. That's admirable, Fletcher said. Takes courage to start over. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, climbing higher into the mountains. The trees grew thicker here, providing welcome shade from the sun. Birds sang in the branches, and occasionally Penelope caught glimpses of deer or rabbits watching them from the underbrush. After what felt like hours but was probably closer to 2, they emerged into a clearing that took Penelope's breath away. A meadow spread before them, carpeted in wildflowers of every color imaginable. Purple lupin mixed with yellow buttercups and white columbine. A stream bubbled through the center of the meadow, the water crystal clear and sparkling in the sunlight. And beyond it all, rising against the blue sky, were the mountains themselves, their peaks still touched with snow despite the summer heat. Oh, Penelope breathed, unable to find more words. Thought you might like this spot, Fletcher said with obvious satisfaction. He dismounted and came to help her down. His hands spanned her waist easily, and he lifted her from the saddle as if she weighed nothing at all. For a moment she was suspended in the air, eye level with him, and the intensity of his gaze made her heart stutter. Then her feet touched the ground, and he released her, though she could still feel the warmth of his hands through her dress. It is beautiful, she managed to say. The most beautiful place I have ever seen. Fletcher led the horses to the stream to drink, then hobbled them so they could graze on the meadow grass. Penelope spread a blanket she had brought and began unpacking the basket of food. Simple fare, bread and cheese and cold chicken, but it felt like a feast in this magical setting. They sat together on the blanket, eating and talking. Fletcher told her about his life in the mountains, hunting and trapping and living mostly off the land. He had built his cabin himself, hauling logs and fitting them together with his own hands. In the winter he sometimes went weeks without seeing another soul, snowed in and isolated. But he did not mind the solitude. It had healed something in him that civilization had broken. Penelope talked about her childhood before her father's drinking had gotten bad, when her mother was still alive and their small family had been happy. She spoke of her love of reading and how she had dreamed of becoming a teacher before circumstances had made that impossible. She shared her hopes of saving enough money to maybe open her own small business someday, though she was not sure yet what kind. You could do it, Fletcher said with conviction. You're smart and determined, I can see that. How can you be so sure? You barely know me, Penelope said, though his confidence in her warmed something deep inside her chest. I'm a good judge of character, Fletcher replied. Learned to read people during the war, and I can see your strength, even if you can't yet. You came to a new place with nothing, and you're building a life. That takes more courage than most people have. They talked for hours, losing track of time as the sun moved across the sky. Penelope learned that Fletcher was 32, that he had grown up on a farm in Missouri, that his favorite food was apple pie, and that he could play the harmonica though he had not touched one in years. Fletcher learned that Penelope was 21, that she had been born in St. Louis but had lived in various mining camps as her father chased opportunities, that she could sew beautifully and loved storms, and that she had always wanted to see the ocean. When the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Fletcher reluctantly announced they should head back. Don't want to worry, Mrs. Cooper, he said, or have you riding in the dark. They packed up their things and mounted the horses for the return journey. But as they prepared to leave the meadow, Fletcher paused and looked at Penelope with an expression she could not quite read. I had a good day, he said simply. Best day I've had in a long time. So did I, Penelope replied, and she realized it was absolutely true. She could not remember the last time she had felt this happy, this light. The ride back seemed shorter, perhaps because neither of them wanted it to end. They talked less, but the silence was comfortable, peaceful. When they finally arrived back in Carlin, the sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Fletcher helped Penelope dismount and walked her to the boarding house steps. Thank you for coming, he said. I know spending the day with a rough mountain man probably wasn't how you expected to spend your Sunday. It was exactly how I wanted to spend it, Penelope said firmly. And you are not rough. You are kind and interesting, and I had a wonderful time. Fletcher smiled, a genuine full smile that transformed his entire face and made him look younger. Can I see you again? Next time I'm in town? I would like that very much, Penelope said, her own smile matching his. It's a date then, Fletcher said, and the word hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility. After Fletcher left, Penelope floated into the boarding house to find Mrs. Cooper waiting with barely suppressed curiosity. How was your day? The older woman asked. Perfect, Penelope replied, and she meant it with her whole heart. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange mixture of anticipation and routine. Penelope continued her work at the boarding house, but now she caught herself daydreaming at odd moments, remembering the way Fletcher had looked in the mountain meadow, or the sound of his laugh when she had said something amusing, or the strength in his hands as he had lifted her down from the horse. She was falling for him. She knew it with a certainty that both thrilled and frightened her. Fletcher Wade was unlike any man she had ever met, and the intensity of her feelings for him after such a short time made her question her own judgment. But then she would remember the way he had looked at her, the gentleness in his touch despite his enormous strength, the respect he had shown her from the very beginning, and she would think maybe, just maybe, this was something real. True to his word, Fletcher returned to Carlin 2 weeks later. Penelope was in the front parlor of the boarding house, mending linens, when she heard his voice asking for her at the door. She nearly stabbed herself with the needle in her haste to set aside her work. Fletcher stood on the porch, hat in hand, looking slightly nervous. Miss Lancaster, he said, I was hoping I could take you to dinner, if you're free this evening. Carlin had only one restaurant, a small establishment run by a Chinese family named Chen. It was modest but clean, and the food was good. Penelope had never eaten there herself, unable to justify the expense, but she had heard Mrs. Cooper praise their cooking. I would be honored, Penelope said, her heart singing. That evening, dressed in her best dress, the one she had been saving for a special occasion, Penelope walked with Fletcher through town to the restaurant. She was aware of people watching, whispering, but with Fletcher beside her, solid and protective, she found she did not care. The Chen family greeted them warmly and showed them to a small table by the window. Fletcher ordered for them both, and soon plates of steaming food arrived, unfamiliar dishes that Fletcher explained as he encouraged her to try everything. I eat here every time I come to town, Fletcher said. Mrs. Chen is the best cook in Nevada as far as I'm concerned. The food was indeed delicious, flavorful, and satisfying, but even better was the conversation. They picked up where they had left off 2 weeks ago, talking and laughing as if no time had passed at all. Fletcher told her about a bear he had seen near his cabin, a massive creature that he had watched from a safe distance. Penelope shared a funny story about a confused guest at the boarding house who had walked into the wrong room and scared poor Mrs. Cooper half to death. When the meal was finished, Fletcher walked her back to the boarding house slowly, neither of them eager to end the evening. The night was warm, and stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. At the boarding house steps, Fletcher paused and turned to face Penelope. I want to be honest with you about something, he said, his voice serious. Penelope's heart clenched with sudden worry. What is it? I'm not good with words, never have been, and I'm out of practice with people in general. But I need you to know that I have feelings for you, Penelope. Strong feelings. I think about you when I'm up in the mountains. I count the days until I can come back to town and see you again. He took a deep breath, his green eyes locked on hers. I know we haven't known each other long, but I'm old enough to know when something is special, and you are special. What I feel for you is special. Tears prickled at the corners of Penelope's eyes, but they were good tears, happy tears. I have feelings for you too, Fletcher. I have since the day you stood up for me in Miller's store. You made me feel valued and protected and seen in a way I never have before. Fletcher reached out and gently took her hand, his large fingers engulfing her smaller ones. I want to court you properly if you'll let me. I know I'm not much of a catch, living up in the mountains like I do, and I know you could probably find someone more refined, someone who fits better in town. But I care about you, and I would do everything in my power to make you happy. You are everything I could want, Penelope said firmly, squeezing his hand. I do not care about refined. I care about kind and honest and brave, and you are all of those things. Yes, Fletcher, I would very much like you to court me. The smile that spread across Fletcher's face was radiant. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently, a gesture so tender it made Penelope's breath catch. You've made me the happiest man in Nevada, he said softly. From that night on, Fletcher Wade and Penelope Lancaster were officially courting. It was an unconventional courtship, limited by the fact that Fletcher spent most of his time in the mountains. But he came to town every week now instead of every 2 weeks, and they spent every moment they could together. Fletcher began teaching Penelope to ride properly. Not just sitting on gentle Daisy, but actually learning to control and guide a horse. They took long rides into the foothills, exploring new trails and hidden valleys. Fletcher showed her how to identify different plants, which ones were edible and which were medicinal. He taught her to read animal tracks in the soft earth and to listen to the sounds of the forest. In turn, Penelope helped Fletcher reconnect with the parts of civilization he had left behind. She convinced him to attend the town's summer dance, held in the community hall at the end of August. Fletcher was uncomfortable at first, surrounded by so many people in an enclosed space, but with Penelope's hand in his, he managed. They danced together, Fletcher's strength carefully controlled as he guided her through the steps, and Penelope felt like she was floating. The dance was also where they faced their first real challenge as a couple. Jacob Miller, the storekeeper's son, had had too much to drink. He was a few years younger than Penelope, perhaps 19, and known for being mean-spirited like his father. As Penelope stood by the refreshment table while Fletcher went to get them drinks, Jacob approached with a sneer on his face. "Well, look who thinks she's too good for regular folk now," Jacob said, his words slurred. "Got yourself a mountain man to fight your battles for you." "I do not want any trouble, Jacob," Penelope said quietly. Trying to move away, Jacob blocked her path. "My pa was right about you. You're nothing but a charity case. Probably just latched onto Wade because you need someone to take care of you." "That is not true," Penelope said, her cheeks burning with embarrassment as nearby people began to notice the confrontation. "Isn't it? Everyone knows you came here with nothing. You're using that poor fool, just like your father used everyone around him." Fletcher appeared so quickly and silently that Jacob didn't even see him coming. One moment Jacob was smirking down at Penelope, and the next Fletcher's hand was on his shoulder, spinning him around. "Apologize," Fletcher said, his voice deadly quiet. "Right now." Jacob paled when he saw who had grabbed him. "I was just talking." "You were insulting the woman I love," Fletcher said, and even through her distress Penelope's heart leaped at those words. "Now apologize or leave. Your choice." "It is a free country," Jacob blustered. "I can say what I want." "And I can throw you out on your backside," Fletcher replied. "Which is what I'm going to do if you do not apologize in the next 10 seconds. Jacob looked around for support but found none. The other dancers were watching with interest, and several of the men looked like they would be happy to help Fletcher if it came to that. The Millers were not well liked in Carlin. "Sorry," Jacob muttered, not meeting Penelope's eyes. "Say it like you mean it," Fletcher demanded, his grip on Jacob's shoulder tightening. "Look at her and apologize properly." Jacob finally looked at Penelope, and there was real fear in his eyes now. "I apologize, Miss Lancaster. I was out of line." "Better," Fletcher said, releasing him. "Now get out of here before I change my mind about letting you off so easy." Jacob scurried away like a rat fleeing a sinking ship. The other dancers gradually went back to their conversations and dancing, though Penelope was aware of sympathetic looks directed her way. Fletcher turned to her, concern replacing the anger on his face. "Are you all right? Did he hurt you?" "I am fine," Penelope assured him, though her hands were shaking slightly. "Thank you for defending me again." Fletcher pulled her into a quiet corner, away from prying eyes and ears. "Penelope, I need to know you understand something. I didn't defend you because I think you need protecting. I did it because nobody should have to tolerate that kind of disrespect. You are strong and capable, but you should not have to face cruelty alone. Not when you have me." "I know," Penelope said, her eyes shining with unshed tears, "and I appreciate it more than I can say." "You make me feel cherished, Fletcher, like I matter." "You do matter," Fletcher said fiercely. "You matter to me more than anything else in this world." He paused, then added more softly. "Did you hear what I said to Jacob about throwing him out?" Penelope asked, though she knew that was not what he meant. "About loving you," Fletcher clarified. "I meant it, Penelope. I love you. I think I have since the day I first saw you standing in Miller's store, trying so hard to be strong in the face of cruelty." Penelope felt tears spill over onto her cheeks, but she was smiling through them. "I love you too, Fletcher. So very much." Fletcher cupped her face in his large hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes," Penelope whispered. "Please." He bent down and pressed his lips to hers, gentle despite his size and strength. It was Penelope's first real kiss, and it was everything she had dreamed a kiss should be. Sweet and tender and filled with promise. She felt his hands trembling slightly against her face and realized he was as affected by this as she was. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing heavily. Fletcher rested his forehead against hers and smiled. "I want to marry you, Penelope Lancaster. I know it is probably too soon to say that, but I have never been one for playing games or hiding what I feel. I want you to be my wife." Penelope's heart felt like it might burst from happiness. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you, Fletcher Wade." They left the dance early, too wrapped up in their own joy to care about socializing. Fletcher walked Penelope back to the boarding house, and they spent an hour sitting on the porch swing, planning their future together. "I want you to see the cabin before we marry," Fletcher said. "Make sure you're comfortable with the idea of living up there. It is isolated, Penelope. Beautiful but isolated. I would understand if you decided it wasn't for you." "I want to see it," Penelope said, "but I already know I will love it because you built it, and being with you is more important than where we live." Still, Fletcher insisted, "I want you to see what you're agreeing to. How about next week? You could come up for a few days, stay with me at the cabin. Mrs. Cooper can chaperone if that would be proper." Penelope laughed at the idea of bringing Mrs. Cooper along on a mountain expedition, but she appreciated Fletcher's respect for propriety. "Let me talk to Mrs. Cooper. Maybe she would be willing to come for at least one day, to see where I will be living." Mrs. Cooper was more than willing. In fact, she was thrilled for Penelope, and declared that a mountain man like Fletcher Wade was exactly what the girl needed. "Someone strong and steady, who will appreciate you," the older woman said. "I could not have picked better myself." The following Sunday, Fletcher arrived with 3 horses, including a sturdy one for Mrs. Cooper. The ride to the cabin took most of the morning, climbing higher and deeper into the mountains than Penelope had gone before. But when they finally arrived, she fell immediately in love. Fletcher's cabin was tucked into a small valley surrounded by tall pines and aspens. A stream ran nearby, the same one that fed into the meadow where they had picnicked on their first outing. The cabin itself was larger than Penelope had expected, built from solid logs that Fletcher had cut and notched himself. It had real glass windows, a luxury in such a remote location, and a stone chimney rose from one end. Inside, the cabin was surprisingly homely. One large room served as living space with a kitchen area, a table and chairs, and a comfortable-looking bed covered in furs and blankets. A loft overhead provided additional storage and sleeping space. Everything was neat and well-maintained, showing Fletcher's care for his home. "I built it to last," Fletcher said, watching Penelope's face as she took it all in. "Made it bigger than I needed because I always hoped someday I might have a family to fill it." "It is wonderful," Penelope said honestly. "Better than anywhere I have ever lived." Mrs. Cooper stayed for lunch, but then announced she was ready to head back to town. "These old bones cannot take too much riding in one day," she said with a wink at Penelope. "You two enjoy showing the place off. I will see you tomorrow, dear." After Mrs. Cooper left with promises to return the next morning, Fletcher and Penelope were finally alone. Fletcher showed her everything, from the spring house where he kept things cool to the shed where he stored his trapping equipment and smoked meat. He introduced her to his 2 hunting dogs, a pair of friendly hounds who had been exploring while they were inside. He pointed out the garden plot where he grew vegetables, and the places nearby where wild berries grew in abundance. "I am mostly self-sufficient up here," Fletcher explained. "Hunt for meat, grow or gather vegetables, trade pelts for the few things I cannot make myself. It is a good life, but it is a hard life sometimes. Winters are long and cold. You would be snowed in for months. But I would be with you," Penelope said simply. "That makes everything worthwhile." They spent the rest of the afternoon talking about practical matters. Where they would marry, probably in the small church in Carlin. When they would marry, likely in September before the mountain weather turned harsh. What they would need to prepare for Penelope to move to the cabin permanently. As evening fell, Fletcher made dinner over the fire, demonstrating skills Penelope would need to learn. He showed her how to cook on the open hearth, how to bank the fire to keep it going overnight, how to manage the damper in the stove. Penelope absorbed it all eagerly, determined to be a good partner to him in this mountain life. They talked long into the night, sitting in front of the fire, Fletcher in his chair, and Penelope in the one he pulled up beside it. She felt safe and content in a way she had never experienced before. This cabin, this mountain, this man, they were all becoming home to her. When it grew late, Fletcher banked the fire and showed Penelope to the bed. "You take it," he said. "I will sleep in the loft." "Fletcher, this is your home," Penelope protested. "I cannot take your bed." "You are going to be my wife," Fletcher said with a gentle smile. "That makes it your home too, and I want you comfortable. Please, Penelope, it would make me happy to know you slept well." She finally agreed, touched by his consideration. As she settled into the comfortable bed, surrounded by the scent of pine and leather that she was beginning to associate with Fletcher, she heard him climbing the ladder to the loft. She smiled into the darkness, thinking about how lucky she was to have found this man. Mrs. Cooper returned the next morning as promised, and they made the journey back to Carlin together. But Penelope's heart remained in the mountains, in the cabin she would soon call home. The next month was a whirlwind of preparation. Penelope and Fletcher decided to marry on the last Sunday in September, giving them time to make arrangements but not so long that the mountain weather might turn dangerous. The ceremony would be simple, held in the small Methodist church with Reverend Thompson officiating. Penelope had very few possessions to bring to her new life, but Mrs. Cooper and several of the other kind women in town helped her assemble what she would need. They gave her dishes and cookware, blankets and linens, jars for preserving food. The blacksmith's wife, a skilled seamstress, helped Penelope make a wedding dress from the fabric she had bought that first day at Miller's store. It was simple but pretty, cream-colored with lace at the collar and cuffs. Fletcher came to town every few days during that month, always with some new thing for the cabin. He bought a better stove, one with an oven for baking. He made a new dresser for Penelope's clothes, working late into the night at the livery where he had space and tools. He even found a small mirror with a pretty frame, knowing women liked such things. But the best gift he gave her was a small leather-bound journal and a set of pencils. "For writing down your thoughts," he said when he presented it to her, "or stories if you want. I know you love reading, and I thought maybe you would like writing too." Penelope hugged the journal to her chest, deeply moved. "How did you know I always wanted to write?" "You have a way with words," Fletcher said. "The way you describe things when we talk. I can see it in my mind so clearly. That is a gift, Penelope. And up in the mountains, you will have plenty of quiet time to use it." The wedding day arrived bright and clear, an unseasonably cool morning that felt like a gift after the oppressive heat of summer. Penelope woke early, too excited to sleep, and Mrs. Cooper helped her dress and arrange her hair. The older woman was tearful as she looked at Penelope in her wedding dress. "You look beautiful, dear," Mrs. Cooper said, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "And so happy, that is what matters most." The church was small but filled with everyone who had shown Penelope kindness since her arrival in Carlin. The Chen family was there, along with the blacksmith and his wife, the doctor, several of Fletcher's regular trading partners, and various other townspeople who had come to respect the quiet mountain man and the determined young woman who had won his heart. Noticeably absent were the Millers, father and son. Penelope did not mind their absence in the least. Fletcher stood at the front of the church with Reverend Thompson, and when Penelope entered on Mrs. Cooper's arm, she watched his expression transform. His green eyes went wide, and his mouth opened slightly as if he had forgotten how to breathe. He looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world, and Penelope felt tears of joy prick her eyes. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. They exchanged vows, promising to love and honor each other through all the days of their lives. Fletcher's voice was steady and strong as he made his promises, and Penelope's was clear and certain as she made hers. When Reverend Thompson pronounced them husband and wife, Fletcher kissed her with a tenderness that made the small congregation sigh with approval. The townspeople had arranged a simple reception in the church hall, with food and music and well wishes. Penelope and Fletcher stayed for a few hours, grateful for the community's acceptance and support. But as the afternoon wore on, they were both eager to begin their new life together. They left Carlin in the late afternoon, riding side by side toward the mountains. Penelope was on Daisy, who was now officially hers, while Fletcher rode his gelding. A pack horse followed behind, laden with Penelope's belongings and wedding gifts. The ride to the cabin was familiar now, and Penelope enjoyed it even more knowing she was not just visiting but going home. The sun was setting as they arrived, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. Fletcher helped Penelope dismount, but instead of releasing her, he swept her up into his arms. "What are you doing?" Penelope laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Carrying my bride over the threshold," Fletcher said with a grin. "It is tradition." He carried her into the cabin and set her gently on her feet in front of the fire he had built before leaving for town days ago. It had been banked and was now blazing cheerfully, warming the space and filling it with dancing light. "Welcome home, Mrs. Wade," Fletcher said softly, pulling her into his arms. "Home," Penelope repeated, loving the sound of it. "I like that very much." They spent their wedding night in the cabin, learning each other in the flickering firelight. Fletcher was gentle and patient, mindful of Penelope's inexperience, and she fell even more deeply in love with him for his consideration. He made her feel cherished and beautiful and desired, and when they finally fell asleep in each other's arms, Penelope knew she had found her place in the world. The next days and weeks were an adjustment as Penelope learned the rhythms of mountain life. Fletcher was a patient teacher, showing her how to manage the household, tend the garden, preserve food for winter, and handle the various tasks necessary for survival in such an isolated place. Penelope proved to be a quick learner, and Fletcher often praised her adaptability and determination. They fell into comfortable routines. Fletcher would rise early to check his trap lines or hunt, while Penelope managed the cabin and prepared meals. In the evenings they would sit by the fire, Fletcher working on various projects while Penelope read aloud from the books he had accumulated over the years, or wrote in her journal. They talked endlessly about everything and nothing, and Penelope marveled at how comfortable silence could be with the right person. Their first trip to town as a married couple was in mid-October, when Fletcher needed to trade pelts and stock up on supplies before winter. Penelope accompanied him, and they stopped at Miller's store because, as Fletcher pointed out, it was still the only general store around, and they needed to be practical. Jacob Miller was not present, but his father was behind the counter as usual. When Fletcher and Penelope entered, Miller's expression soured, but he did not refuse them service. He filled their order with minimal conversation, clearly resentful but not willing to cross Fletcher again. As they were leaving, Miller called out, "You might want to know, Wade, that I heard you're doing well with your trapping this year." Fletcher paused and looked back. "That's right. Been a good season so far." Miller seemed to struggle with himself for a moment, then said grudgingly, "Good for you both. Seems like you've made a decent match." It was not exactly an enthusiastic endorsement, but coming from Miller it was practically a blessing. Fletcher nodded acknowledgement, and they left the store together. "Did that just happen?" Penelope asked, almost laughing. "Did Mr. Miller just give us his approval?" "I think that was as close as he gets," Fletcher said with amusement. "Maybe even he can recognize a good thing when he sees it." Winter came to the mountains in early November, and Penelope experienced her first real snowfall in the high country. It was more beautiful and more isolating than she had imagined. The snow fell for 3 days straight, piling up outside the cabin until they were truly snowed in. But Penelope found she did not mind. The cabin was warm and well stocked, and having Fletcher all to herself for weeks on end felt like an extended honeymoon. They spent the long winter evenings in various pursuits. Fletcher taught Penelope to play chess, using a set he had carved himself. She taught him to appreciate poetry, reading from a volume of Wordsworth she had brought from town. They cooked together, experimented with new recipes, and Fletcher even convinced Penelope to try snowshoeing when the weather cleared. On Christmas morning, Fletcher surprised Penelope with a gift he had been working on in secret. It was a rocking chair, beautifully crafted and perfectly proportioned for her smaller frame. He had carved flowers into the headrest, and the wood was sanded smooth as silk. "For you," he said, looking almost shy as he presented it. "Thought you might like a chair of your own by the fire." Penelope burst into tears, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness and skill involved in such a gift. "It is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen," she said, running her hands over the smooth wood. "Thank you, Fletcher. Thank you so much." She had a gift for him too, though it was much simpler. She had knitted him a new scarf and a pair of warm gloves using yarn she had brought from town. But she had also written him something, a story in her journal about a mountain and a valley who loved each other but could never touch, until the valley sent flowers up the mountain slopes, and the mountain sent streams down to water the valley, and they were together that way. It was fanciful and romantic, and she was nervous as she read it aloud to him. When she finished, Fletcher was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled her into his lap and held her close. "That was beautiful," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have real talent, Penelope. You should keep writing. Promise me you will." "I promise," she said, nestling into his embrace. That winter, wrapped in snow and love, Penelope had never been happier. The isolation that might have broken someone else only served to strengthen their bond. They learned to work together, to communicate without words, to anticipate each other's needs. They grew closer than Penelope had thought possible with another human being. Spring came late to the mountains, not truly arriving until mid-April. When the snow finally melted and the trails became passable again, Fletcher and Penelope made their first trip to town in nearly 5 months. It felt strange to see other people after so long alone together, and Penelope found herself clinging a bit closer to Fletcher's side than usual. They stayed 2 nights at Mrs. Cooper's boarding house, and the older woman was delighted to see them. "You look wonderful, dear," she said to Penelope, hugging her tightly. "Mountain life agrees with you." It was true. Penelope had gained weight over the winter, filling out in a healthy way. Her cheeks had color, and her eyes sparkled with happiness. Fletcher too looked content. The deep lines of tension that had marked his face when they first met now smoothed away. On their second day in town, Penelope noticed a new business opening in one of the empty storefronts. A sign was being hung above the door that read Anderson's General Goods. She pointed it out to Fletcher. "Competition for Miller," Fletcher observed with satisfaction. "About time this town had more than one option." They went inside to investigate and met the owner, a friendly middle-aged man named Thomas Anderson, who had recently moved to Carlin from California. He was setting up shop with his wife and grown daughter, and he welcomed Fletcher and Penelope warmly. "Always happy to have new customers," Anderson said cheerfully. "I hear Miller's been the only game in town for too long. About time folks had a choice where to spend their money." Fletcher and Penelope made a point of buying a few items they did not strictly need just to show their support. As they left, Penelope felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Justice came in many forms, and sometimes it looked like healthy competition. That spring and summer, Penelope and Fletcher settled more deeply into their life together. Penelope's skills at managing the mountain homestead grew, and she even began to excel at tasks Fletcher had not taught her. She started a larger garden, doubling their vegetable production. She learned to preserve fruits and vegetables in new ways, experimenting with techniques from a cookbook Mrs. Cooper had given her. She even tried her hand at tanning hides, working alongside Fletcher to process the pelts from his trapping. But the biggest news came in June, when Penelope began to suspect she was pregnant. She waited a few weeks to be sure before telling Fletcher, wanting to be certain. When she finally shared the news one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Fletcher's reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He went completely still for a moment, processing her words. Then his face split into the biggest smile she had ever seen, and he let out a whoop of joy that echoed through the valley. He pulled her into his arms and spun her around, laughing with pure happiness. "A baby," he kept saying as if he could not quite believe it. "We're going to have a baby." "We are," Penelope confirmed, laughing and crying at the same time. In late December or early January, the doctor thinks, Fletcher immediately became even more protective than usual. He insisted Penelope rest more, that she not lift heavy things, that she be careful on the stairs to the loft. Penelope found his concern sweet but sometimes excessive, and they had their first real argument when he suggested she should move back to town for the winter, to be near the doctor when the baby came. "Absolutely not," Penelope said firmly. "This is our home, Fletcher. I am not going to leave you alone up here for months. Women have been having babies for thousands of years without doctors standing by. Mrs. Cooper has delivered babies before. She can come stay with us when the time gets closer." "But what if something goes wrong?" Fletcher said, his voice tight with worry. "I could not bear it if anything happened to you or the baby." "Nothing is going to go wrong," Penelope said, taking his hands in hers. "I am healthy and strong, and I trust Mrs. Cooper. But more than that, I need to be here with you. Please, Fletcher. Trust me on this." He finally agreed, though Penelope could see the worry never fully left his eyes. They made arrangements with Mrs. Cooper, who agreed to come to the cabin in December and stay until after the baby was born. The doctor gave Penelope a thorough examination and pronounced her healthy, with no reason to expect complications. As fall arrived and Penelope's belly grew round with their child, Fletcher became obsessed with preparing. He chopped enough firewood to last 3 winters. He hunted and smoked enough meat to feed an army. He made sure the cabin was sealed tight against any draft, that the roof was solid, that every possible problem was anticipated and addressed. He also built a cradle, working on it secretly in the shed while Penelope was occupied with other tasks. It was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, made from smooth pine and carved with woodland creatures, deer and rabbits and birds. When he finally showed it to Penelope in November, she cried at the beauty and love evident in every detail. "Our baby will sleep safe and sound," Fletcher said, gently rocking the empty cradle. "Protected and loved." "Just like their father makes me feel," Penelope said, kissing him softly. Mrs. Cooper arrived at the cabin in early December before the heavy snows began. She brought supplies and her own experience, having delivered over a dozen babies in her time. Her presence eased some of Fletcher's worry, though he still hovered anxiously whenever Penelope so much as winced. The baby came on a cold January night 3 weeks into 1878. Penelope's labor started in the early evening and progressed through the night. Fletcher paced the cabin like a caged animal, following Mrs. Cooper's instructions to heat water and bring clean linens, but clearly feeling helpless in the face of his wife's pain. "This is normal, Fletcher," Mrs. Cooper said for the 20th time. "Women are built for this. Penelope is doing wonderfully." As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of pink and gold, a baby's cry filled the cabin. Fletcher, who had been banished to the porch for the final moments, came crashing through the door at the sound. "You have a son," Mrs. Cooper announced, beaming as she wrapped the squalling infant in a soft blanket. "A big, healthy boy." Penelope, exhausted but radiant, held out her arms for her baby. Mrs. Cooper placed the tiny bundle in her embrace, and Penelope looked down at the small red face with overwhelming love. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We have been waiting for you." Fletcher approached slowly, almost reverently. When Penelope gestured for him to sit beside them, he did so carefully, as if afraid he might break something. "He's perfect," Fletcher breathed, gently touching the baby's tiny hand. The infant's fingers immediately wrapped around Fletcher's massive finger, and the mountain man's eyes filled with tears. Absolutely perfect. They named him Samuel Fletcher Wade, Samuel after Penelope's mother's father, the only relative she had happy memories of. Little Samuel, or Sam as they quickly began calling him, was indeed perfect. He had Fletcher's green eyes and Penelope's delicate features, and from the beginning he showed a strong personality and healthy lungs. Mrs. Cooper stayed for 2 more weeks, helping Penelope recover and learn to care for her newborn. By the time the older woman left for town, Penelope felt confident, if exhausted. Caring for an infant was more demanding than she had imagined, but she would not have traded it for anything in the world. Fletcher was a devoted father from the start. Despite his size and strength, he was incredibly gentle with Sam, holding the tiny baby with such care and love that Penelope often found herself tearing up at the sight. He would walk the floor with Sam for hours when the baby was fussy, singing old songs in his deep voice until Sam fell asleep on his broad chest. That winter was the longest of Penelope's life, not because she was unhappy, but because time seemed to move differently with a newborn. Days blurred together in a cycle of feeding and sleeping, and the 100 small tasks involved in caring for an infant. But it was also magical. Watching Sam grow and change, seeing Fletcher's fierce love for his son, feeling the completion of their family. When spring finally arrived, Sam was 4 months old and beginning to notice the world around him. Fletcher made a carrier that allowed Penelope to strap Sam to her chest, keeping him close while leaving her hands free for work. They took short walks together around the homestead, Penelope pointing out flowers and birds to Sam, who watched everything with wide green eyes. Their first trip to town with Sam was in May, and it felt like a parade. Everyone wanted to see the mountain man's baby, and Sam was duly admired and exclaimed over. Mrs. Cooper cried when she held him, and even gruff old Thomas Anderson at the general store softened when he looked at the baby. The biggest surprise came from Jacob Miller. They encountered him on the street, and Penelope braced herself for trouble. But Jacob stopped and looked at Sam for a long moment, then met Penelope's eyes. "Congratulations," he said quietly. "He's a fine-looking boy." Then, even more quietly, "I'm sorry for how I treated you before. You didn't deserve that." Penelope was so shocked she almost could not respond. "Thank you, Jacob, that means a lot." After he walked away, Fletcher let out a low whistle. Will wonders never cease? Maybe there is hope for everyone. Life settled into new rhythms as Sam grew. He was a happy baby who thrived in the mountain air. By his first birthday, he was walking and getting into everything, requiring constant supervision. Fletcher baby proofed the cabin as much as possible, but Sam seemed to have inherited his father's adventurous spirit and his mother's determination, a combination that kept both parents on their toes. Penelope continued her writing, now with less time but perhaps more purpose. She wrote about mountain life, about motherhood, about love and family. She was not sure what she would do with the stories, but the act of writing them brought her joy and helped her process the incredible changes in her life. When Sam was 2, Penelope discovered she was pregnant again. This time the news was less surprising but no less wonderful. Fletcher's reaction was just as joyful, though perhaps slightly more tempered by the knowledge of what pregnancy and childbirth actually entailed. "As long as you're happy and healthy," he said, kissing her forehead. "That is all that matters to me." Their daughter was born in October 1880, arriving quickly and with far less drama than Sam's birth. Fletcher was present this time, having refused to be banished, and he cut the cord with shaking hands while Mrs. Cooper supervised. They named her Rose, after the wild roses that grew near the cabin. Rose was different from Sam from the start, quieter and more observant. Where Sam had been all energy and movement, Rose was content to watch the world from the safety of her parents' arms. She had Penelope's honey-colored hair and Fletcher's strong features, a beautiful baby who grew into a lovely child. With 2 children, the cabin felt full and alive in ways Penelope had never imagined when she first arrived in Carlin as a lonely orphan. Every day brought new challenges and new joys. Sam was a bundle of questions and energy, constantly exploring and testing boundaries. Rose was his shadow, toddling after him with determination even though she was 2 years younger. Fletcher proved to be an excellent father, patient and loving but also firm when necessary. He taught Sam to respect the mountains and the animals they shared the land with. He showed him how to track deer and identify plants. He gave him small tasks appropriate for a young child, building his confidence and skills. Penelope homeschooled both children, teaching them to read and write and do arithmetic. She read to them constantly from the books they had accumulated and from her own stories. Rose loved the stories especially, asking for them again and again until she had memorized her favorites. The years passed in a blur of happiness. Fletcher's trapping business continued to do well, and they slowly improved the homestead. They built an addition onto the cabin, giving the children their own room. Fletcher dug a proper well, making water access easier. Penelope expanded her garden until it was producing far more than they could eat, allowing them to trade vegetables in town. They made the trip to Carlin regularly, staying connected to the small community there. Sam and Rose had friends in town, children they saw a few times a year and played with eagerly. The children also developed a close relationship with Mrs. Cooper, who spoiled them shamelessly whenever they visited. When Sam was 8 and Rose was 6, Penelope realized with surprise that she and Fletcher had been married for nearly 10 years. A decade of love and partnership, of building a life together in the mountains. It seemed impossible that so much time had passed, but the evidence was everywhere, in their growing children, in the established homestead, in the deep bond between her and Fletcher that had only strengthened over time. Fletcher surprised her on their 10th anniversary with a trip back to the meadow where they had spent their first day together. They left the children with Mrs. Cooper and rode out together, just the two of them, recreating that early adventure. The meadow was exactly as Penelope remembered, carpeted in wildflowers and bordered by the crystal stream. They spread a blanket and lay together in the sunshine, holding hands and talking about everything they had experienced over the past decade. "I knew that day," Fletcher said, playing with a strand of Penelope's hair. "When I brought you here, I knew I wanted to spend the rest of my life with you." "I knew in Miller's store," Penelope admitted. "When you stood up for me, I knew you were someone special, someone worth loving." "Best decision I ever made," Fletcher said, rolling onto his side to look at her. "Defending you that day changed my whole life." "Mine, too," Penelope said softly. "You saved me, Fletcher. Not just from Miller's cruelty, but from a life of loneliness and shame. You gave me a family, a home, a purpose. You gave me everything. You gave me more," Fletcher insisted. "You brought light back into my life. After the war, I thought I was done with living, just existing. You reminded me what it meant to be truly alive, what it meant to love and be loved. You, Sam, and Rose. You are my whole world." They made love there in the meadow, unhurried and tender, reaffirming the bond that had sustained them through a decade of life together. Afterward, they lay wrapped in each other's arms and talked about the future. "I want to grow old with you here," Fletcher said. "Watch our children grow up and have children of their own. Build something lasting that will outlive us both." "That sounds perfect," Penelope said, and she meant it with her entire heart. The years continued to unfold with their share of joys and challenges. Sam grew into a strong young man, tall and broad like his father, with the same green eyes and love of the mountains. He learned everything Fletcher could teach him about survival and tracking, and by the time he was 14, he was an accomplished hunter and trapper in his own right. Rose developed into a beautiful young woman, intelligent and kind, with a gift for words like her mother. She loved reading and writing, and Penelope taught her everything she knew. Rose dreamed of becoming a teacher someday, perhaps in Carlin, and both Fletcher and Penelope encouraged her ambitions. In 1892, when Sam was 16 and Rose was 14, the family faced their first real tragedy. A late spring blizzard caught Fletcher out on the trap lines. He made it home, but with severe frostbite on his hands and feet. The doctor from Carlin came up to the cabin, a treacherous journey made possible only by Sam's excellent navigation skills, and did what he could. Fletcher lost 3 toes from his left foot, but his hands were saved. The recovery was painful and slow, and for the first time in their marriage, Penelope saw Fletcher truly vulnerable. He struggled with feeling useless, unable to work as he healed, and worried constantly about providing for his family. "We are fine," Penelope told him firmly, over and over. "Sam is more than capable of handling the trap lines for now. I have the garden and my preserves. We have savings. You just focus on healing." It took 3 months for Fletcher to fully recover, and even then his mobility was slightly impaired. He limped now, especially in cold weather, and the loss of those toes affected his balance. But he adapted, as he had adapted to so much in his life, and within a year he was back to his normal activities. If a bit more cautious, the incident had one unexpected positive outcome. It prompted Fletcher and Penelope to start planning seriously for the future. Sam was nearly grown and would need his own place soon if he chose to stay in the mountains. Rose wanted to attend the new school in Carlin, and perhaps eventually go to teachers' college in Carson City. They sat down as a family and talked about dreams and goals. Sam admitted he wanted to build his own cabin about 5 miles from theirs, starting his own trap line in a valley he had scouted. Fletcher and Penelope agreed to help him, and over the next 2 years working together during the warm months, they built Sam a solid cabin of his own. Rose moved to Carlin in 1893 to attend school, boarding with Mrs. Cooper. Penelope missed her daughter terribly, but she was proud of Rose's determination to pursue her education. Fletcher made the trip to town more frequently during that year, ostensibly for trading but really to check on Rose and make sure she was happy and safe. In 1896, when Sam was 20, he married a young woman named Margaret who had come to Carlin with her family. She was strong and practical, qualities necessary for mountain life, and she adapted well to the isolated lifestyle. Sam and Margaret made their home in his cabin, and within a year they had their first child, a daughter they named Penelope in honor of her grandmother. Fletcher and Penelope became grandparents at 44 and 39 respectively, young enough to fully enjoy their granddaughter. Little Penelope, or Penny as they called her, became a frequent visitor to their cabin, and Fletcher proved to be as devoted a grandfather as he had been a father. Rose completed her schooling and received a teaching certificate. She taught for 2 years in Carlin before catching the eye of the new doctor who had taken over the practice. Charles Whitman was a good man, intelligent and kind, and he courted Rose with old-fashioned propriety that won Fletcher's approval. They married in 1898, and Fletcher proudly walked his daughter down the aisle of the same church where he and Penelope had married 22 years earlier. Charles and Rose settled in Carlin, and within 3 years they had 2 children of their own, a boy and a girl. Rose continued teaching part-time, balancing motherhood with her professional ambitions. As the new century dawned, Fletcher and Penelope found themselves in their mid-40s, looking back on over 20 years of marriage and a life well lived. Their children were grown and thriving, establishing families of their own. The homestead was secure and productive. They had weathered storms, both literal and figurative, and emerged stronger for it. They still made regular trips to Carlin, now to visit Rose and her family as much as for supplies. The town had grown and changed over the years. Miller's General Goods had closed after Old Man Miller died, and Jacob decided to move to California. Anderson's store thrived along with 2 new competitors. There was talk of a railroad spur being built through Carlin, connecting the town more firmly to the wider world. But the mountains remained largely unchanged, still wild and beautiful. Still the sanctuary Fletcher and Penelope had made their home. The cabin had expanded over the years, with additional rooms and improvements, but its heart remained the same large room where they had spent their wedding night so many years ago. Penelope continued writing throughout these years, filling journal after journal with stories and observations. On their 25th anniversary, Fletcher surprised her with a trip to Carson City, where they visited a publisher he had been corresponding with secretly. The publisher was interested in Penelope's stories of mountain life, thinking they would appeal to Eastern readers fascinated by the frontier. The shock and joy on Penelope's face when Fletcher revealed this plan was something he would treasure forever. Her first book, Tales from the Mountain, was published in 1902 to modest success. It would be followed by 3 more books over the next decade, each one sharing the beauty and challenges of life in the Nevada mountains. Fletcher was immensely proud of his wife's accomplishment, showing her books to anyone who would look. "My Penelope," he would say, his voice full of love and pride, "always knew she was special." The years continued to pass, bringing the normal rhythms of life. Sam and Margaret had 3 more children, filling their valley with laughter and activity. Rose and Charles had 1 more child, giving them 3 in total. Fletcher and Penelope watched their family grow, marveling at how their love had created this sprawling network of relationships and connections. They grew older together gracefully, silver threading through their hair, lines deepening on their faces. Fletcher's limp became more pronounced as arthritis set in, and Penelope's vision began to fail slightly, requiring reading glasses. But they remained active and engaged, still working the homestead, still making the trip to town, still in love after decades together. On their 30th anniversary in 1906, their entire family gathered at the mountain cabin for a celebration. Sam and Margaret came with all 4 children. Rose and Charles made the trip from Carlin with their 3. Mrs. Cooper, now in her 80s but still spry, came along with Rose's family. The cabin overflowed with people and noise and love. Fletcher stood on the porch that evening, looking out over his valley with Penelope tucked under his arm. Their grandchildren played in the meadow below, 7 in total, ranging from 6 to 15 years old. Sam was teaching the older ones how to skip stones in the stream. Rose was reading to the younger ones under a tree. Margaret and Charles were chatting with Mrs. Cooper, their laughter drifting up to the cabin. "Look at what we built," Fletcher said softly, his voice full of wonder. All of this, from one day when I walked into Miller's store and saw a woman being treated unfairly. You could have walked away, Penelope said, turning to look up at him. Most people would have. But you didn't. You stood up for me, a complete stranger. Best decision I ever made, Fletcher said, the same words he had spoken so many times over the years. You were worth standing up for then, and you're worth standing up for now. You're worth everything, Penelope. As are you, Penelope replied, her eyes shining with tears and love. My mountain man, my hero, my home. They kissed there on the porch, surrounded by the evidence of their love as the sun set over the mountains and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Below them, their family continued to laugh and play. Multiple generations brought together by two people who had dared to love when the world might have pulled them apart. As night fell and stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the family gathered in and around the cabin. Fletcher built a large fire in the clearing, and they sat around it, roasting food and telling stories. The children begged for tales of the old days, and Fletcher and Penelope obliged, recounting their first meeting, the incident at Miller's store, their courtship and wedding. Tell about when grandfather made mean Mr. Miller apologize, Sam's oldest son begged. He had heard the story before but never tired of it. Fletcher smiled and launched into the tale, embellished slightly for dramatic effect, making the children gasp and laugh at appropriate moments. When he reached the part where he had demanded Miller look Penelope in the eye and apologize properly, the children cheered. And then what happened? One of Rose's daughters asked, even though she knew the answer. Then I fell in love with your grandmother, Fletcher said simply, reaching for Penelope's hand. Because any woman brave enough to face cruelty with dignity, brave enough to start over in a new place with nothing, brave enough to take a chance on a rough mountain man, was a woman worth loving forever. And I fell in love with him, Penelope added, squeezing his hand, because any man courageous enough to stand up for a stranger, kind enough to defend someone who couldn't defend themselves, strong enough to be gentle, was a man worth loving forever. The children sighed happily at this conclusion, and the adults smiled knowingly. Love stories never got old, especially true ones with happy endings. Later that night, after everyone had dispersed to their various sleeping arrangements, Fletcher and Penelope lay in their bed in the cabin's master bedroom, an addition built 10 years ago. Through the open window they could hear the stream and the rustling of wind in the pines. Do you have any regrets? Fletcher asked softly into the darkness. About choosing this life, about choosing me? Not a single one, Penelope answered without hesitation. This life has been everything I could have wanted and so much more. You are everything I could have wanted and so much more. Same here, Fletcher said, pulling her closer. I was half alive before you, Penelope, just going through the motions. You made me whole again. You gave me purpose and joy and a family. You gave me everything worth having. They drifted off to sleep that way, wrapped in each other's arms as they had been for 30 years, as they would continue to be for whatever years remained to them. The Wade family gathering became an annual tradition, held each summer at the mountain cabin. Through the years that followed, the family continued to grow. More grandchildren arrived and eventually great-grandchildren. The cabin was expanded again to accommodate everyone, until it was more of a compound than a single dwelling. Fletcher and Penelope aged together, their bodies slowing but their love remaining constant. Fletcher's hair went fully white, and he walked with a cane now, but he still insisted on taking daily walks around the property. Penelope's hands developed arthritis that made writing difficult, but she dictated her final book to Rose, a memoir of their life together titled Mountain of Love. In 1916, they celebrated their 40th anniversary surrounded by their ever-growing family. Fletcher was 64 and Penelope was 59. By this time, they had 12 grandchildren and 4 great-grandchildren, with more on the way. The celebration lasted an entire week, with family arriving in waves and staying as long as they could. On the actual anniversary day, Fletcher and Penelope took one final trip to their special meadow. Sam drove them in the automobile he had recently purchased, a marvel of modern technology that Fletcher was somewhat suspicious of but Penelope found fascinating. The meadow had changed very little over the decades, still carpeted in wildflowers, still bordered by the crystal stream. They sat together on a blanket, holding hands and remembering their first visit here over 40 years ago. We were so young, Penelope marveled. I had no idea what life had in store for us. Would you have believed it if someone had told you? Fletcher asked with a smile. That we would have 40 years together, 2 children, 12 grandchildren, and great-grandchildren on the way. I would have been afraid to believe it, Penelope admitted. It seemed too good to be true, too perfect, but here we are, and it has been perfect, Fletcher. Every moment, even the difficult ones, has been perfect because we faced them together. No regrets? Fletcher asked, echoing the question he had posed so many times over the years. Not a single one, Penelope answered as she always did, except maybe that we don't have another 40 years ahead of us. We have whatever time we're given, Fletcher said philosophically. And I intend to make every moment count, just like I have from the day I first saw you in that store. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the stream and the birds and the wind in the trees. Eventually, Sam came to collect them, helping his aging parents back to the automobile for the ride home. As they drove away, Penelope looked back at the meadow, imprinting it on her memory one more time. The next years were peaceful ones for Fletcher and Penelope. They handed over most of the physical work of the homestead to Sam and his family, who had moved back to the original cabin to care for them. Their days were spent in quieter pursuits, reading and writing and enjoying their grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Mrs. Cooper passed away in 1918 at the age of 92, a tremendous loss for both Fletcher and Penelope. She had been a constant in their lives from the very beginning, and her death reminded them that their own time was finite. But they celebrated her life rather than mourning her death, remembering all the ways she had supported and encouraged them over the decades. Fletcher began having health problems in 1919, his heart weakening after so many years of hard living. The doctor prescribed rest and limited activity, prescriptions that frustrated Fletcher but that he followed for Penelope's sake. He spent his days in the rocking chair on the porch, usually with a great-grandchild on his lap, telling stories of the old days. Penelope remained in relatively good health, though she tired more easily now. She continued writing almost until the end, filling journals with thoughts and memories and wisdom gained from a life well lived. She wrote letters to each of her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, sharing pieces of advice and family history that she wanted preserved. In the autumn of 1920, Fletcher's health took a turn for the worse. He knew his time was limited, and he asked to be moved to the porch so he could see the mountains one last time. Sam and his sons carried Fletcher's bed outside and positioned it where he could watch the sun set over the peaks he had loved for so many decades. Penelope sat beside him, holding his hand as they watched the sky turn brilliant shades of orange and purple and red. The family gathered around, everyone wanting to be near but giving them space for their private goodbye. "I love you," Fletcher said, his voice weak but clear. "From the first moment to this last one, I have loved you, Penelope." "And I love you," Penelope replied, tears streaming down her face. "Forever, Fletcher, forever and always." "No regrets?" he asked one final time, his green eyes, still bright despite his weakened state, locked on her face. "Not a single one," she answered, her voice breaking. "Only gratitude for every moment we had together." Fletcher squeezed her hand weakly and smiled. "Give me a kiss, my love." Penelope leaned down and kissed him tenderly, tasting salt from her tears. When she pulled back, Fletcher took one more look at the mountains he loved, at the family surrounding him, at the woman who had been his everything for 44 years. Then he closed his eyes and slipped peacefully away. The family mourned Fletcher's passing, but they also celebrated his life. He was buried on a hill overlooking the valley, with a simple stone marker that read Fletcher Wade, beloved husband, father, and grandfather. He stood for what was right. Penelope lived for 3 more years after Fletcher's death, remaining at the mountain cabin surrounded by her family. She never fully recovered from losing him, but she found peace in her children and grandchildren, and in the knowledge that they had had something rare and precious, a love that had lasted a lifetime. She spent her final years organizing her writings and Fletcher's letters, creating a family archive that would preserve their story for future generations. She dictated one final edition to her memoir, detailing their last years together and Fletcher's peaceful passing. Penelope Wade passed away in her sleep on a spring morning in 1923, 66 years old, and surrounded by flowers from the garden she had planted so many decades ago. Her family laid her to rest beside Fletcher on the hill overlooking their valley. Her stone read, "Penelope Lancaster Wade, beloved wife, mother and grandmother." She wrote with love. The mountain cabin remained in the Wade family, passed down through generations. It became a gathering place, a reminder of the love story that had started it all. Fletcher and Penelope's great-great-grandchildren still visit the valley, still hear the stories of the mountain man who defended a stranger in a store, and the brave woman who took a chance on love. The meadow where Fletcher and Penelope shared their first outing remains much as it was, still carpeted in wildflowers each summer. Local tradition says that if you sit quietly in that meadow, you can still feel the love that blossomed there, a love that created a legacy lasting far beyond the 2 people who started it. In Carlin, Nevada, which grew from a small frontier town into a thriving small city, there is a historical marker on the site where Miller's General Goods once stood. It tells the story of Fletcher Wade and Penelope Lancaster, how their love story began with one man standing up for what was right, how that single act of courage and kindness sparked a romance that would last over 4 decades and create a family dynasty that continues to this day. The marker concludes with words taken from Penelope's memoir. The storekeeper refused to sell to her, but the mountain man made him apologize to her face right then. And from that moment of standing up for what was right, a love was born that would last a lifetime and beyond, proving that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the simplest acts of courage and kindness. It is a story still told in Nevada, passed down through families and shared with visitors. The tale of how a lonely mountain man and a brave young woman found each other in the most unlikely circumstances, built a life together in the wild mountains, and created a love story for the ages. A story that reminds everyone who hears it that standing up for what is right, defending those who cannot defend themselves, and being brave enough to love, these are the things that create legacies lasting far beyond a single lifetime. And high in the Nevada mountains, if you know where to look, you can still find the Wade Valley, where wildflowers bloom each summer and a clear stream runs cold from the peaks, where the descendants of Fletcher and Penelope Wade still gather to remember and celebrate the love that started it all, where 2 simple graves on a hillside mark the final resting place of 2 remarkable people who proved that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with a single act of courage and end only when life itself ends, leaving behind a legacy of love that will never be forgotten.